Hi there guys, this is Simon from Ivy Audio, and in this video I'll be giving you a super basic overview of Kontakt programming and some of the fundamentals you should know if you want to get started with Kontakt programming. First off, I'll talk a little bit about KSP, the Kontakt scripting language, and why you should use either nil's kscript editor, which link should be in the description, or the Sublime KSP plugin. So to demonstrate that, I'm going to create a new instrument and show you what script editing looks like without any kind of external editor. So if you come into the script editor here and hit the edit button on the first script slot, here's what your script looks like. There's no syntax highlighting, there's no auto-completion, and you can write scripts in here if you want to, but it's an utter pain. Now you could also use something like Notepad if you wanted to and write your script in here and then paste it in when you're done, or you could use Notepad++, but Nils has already built a fantastic script editor for Kontakt, which has a whole bunch of useful features like additional functions. It allows you to use more complicated mathematical functions inside of the scripting language, which aren't supported by default, and it has auto-completion, which is really, really useful, especially when you're just getting started. So, as you can see, I'm using Sublime Text with the Sublime KSP plugin, which is available to download. The link should also be in the description. It's free. It's amazing the amount of work people have put into making the Kontakt programming language a lot better than it was by default. So now we can talk a little bit about the overall structure of a script. Now, the first thing you're going to see in pretty much any script is the onInit callback. So the way Kontakt functions is you have callbacks. So basically it's a conditional statement. So it says, when a given thing happens, execute this code. You have an onInit callback, which is called the initialization callback, also known as the ICB, and this is the script that runs when you first load an instrument or when you refresh the instrument up here. So in here you're going to put variable declarations, you're going to put maybe some additional parameters, probably declaring UI elements, skinning your UI elements. All of the initialization stuff goes in here, hence the name. We also have a couple of other kinds of callbacks. We have the onUI control, if I can type correctly. And this callback works on a UI control, like a knob or a button. So anytime that given control, knob or button or slider or whatever, gets touched, gets moved, gets updated, this is the code that will execute. And finally, we have the onNote callback, which, as the name implies, executes every time a new note gets played inside of Kontakt. So just using these three callbacks, you can do a whole lot of stuff. There are a couple of more advanced ones like onPGSChanged, but this is really the basics, and a whole lot of scripts are doable with just these three callbacks. So let's go ahead and build a super simple script. First off, in our initialization callback, let's declare a knob. So just type declare. We're going to say UI button, and we're going to name it button. We're going to need to delete these lines for now in order for this to compile correctly, but if we hit F5, that will compile the code and add it to your clipboard so you can paste it directly into Kontakt. And there we go. Here's our button. But you notice when we exited the settings, we no longer have a UI under here. So this is another thing that goes inside of the onInit callback is make perf view. And this enables the performance view so you can build your own custom UIs. And we're going to set height for the UI, which is set UI height. And I'm going to do pixels because it's easier for me. Just set that to 130. Hit F5, compile that, paste it in. And now we have a UI with a height of 130. So, in order to make this instrument a little more interesting, let's grab a couple samples and map them in Kontakt. So we're going to come into the instrument editor, mapping editor. We can close the script editor. And here is the mapping editor, which you can also pop out here, which is really useful if you have multiple monitors and you need a little bit more screen space. You can change the size of the editor up here on the top left. So let's grab some samples. I'll be using the sustains from Claire Solo. And what's interesting about these sustains is there are two round robins. So there are two instances of every note that Claire sang. So we'll map these in Kontakt and write a little script to alternate between those two notes every time you hit a key. There are a couple different ways I could do this. In this particular example, I'll be using two separate groups, and I'll toggle the two groups depending on which round robin I'm playing. So I'll just do a search for RR1, which gives me all of my round robin 1 samples. The first number, of course, corresponds to the pitch, and the round robin number corresponds to the round robin. So let's grab all of these, and you know what, let's rearrange things so it's easier to see. Now the mapping editor is a little bit odd. If you drag samples to the top, it'll actually map each sample across multiple keys. As you can see here, it's mapping across, you know, nearly an octave. And as you drag the samples lower and lower, eventually you'll get it so it's mapping one sample per key, which is how these samples were recorded. So I'll just drop these in maybe at C2. And if we now come into Kontakt and play some notes, that's a bit quiet, we get our notes playing. So now let's take a look at the group editor. All of these samples were placed into group 1, the only group that exists right now. I'm going to create a new group, and I'm going to name this group RR1 for round robin 1, and this one will be called RR2. I'm going to make sure Edit All Groups is deselected, and in the mapping editor, I'm going to tick Selected Groups Only. So our samples disappeared because now we're looking at group 2, which has no samples in it. Our round robin 1 samples are still there, round robin 2 samples aren't. So let's grab our round robin 2 samples, take these, and drop them right in at C2. Now these samples right now are mapped across the entire velocity range. The vertical axis is 0 to 127, which is your velocity, and the x-axis is pitch, which is pretty obvious because of the keyboard at the bottom. So now if I play a note, it's going to trigger whatever note I play at whatever velocity I play in all groups. And you can see a visualization of that by playing a note and watching the groups. As you can see, these two both got highlighted yellow, which indicates that they have an active voice playing back from a sample in that group. Also, you can hear right now we've got some crazy phasing with the samples playing back. Because of course it's playing back two of the same note. So let's write a super basic script to toggle a round robin so that these two groups will alternate every time we play a key. For that, we're going to need an on note callback and our end on. And this is going to be the structure for a lot of your scripts. The first thing you're going to do is ignore event ID. Now, these are special variables. There are several variables that get typed out in all caps, which are variables that you can't assign, you can't declare them. They're specific to functionality within Kontakt. The event ID variable is always going to be the event ID of whatever event triggered back this callback. So if I play a C, I'm going to get one event ID. If I play the C again, the event ID is going to change. And to get a visualization of that, let's actually message event ID. And what this will do is it'll pop up in the bottom here, whatever variable we put inside. I could say message cat if I wanted to, and every time I hit a note, it would say cat at the bottom. But that's not very useful, so let's say event ID instead. So if I hit F5 and compile this, come into the script editor, and paste that in. Now we're not going to hear any sound, because the first thing we're doing is ignoring all events. But as you can see in the bottom here, the last event ID was 43. Click again, 46. Click again, 49. Click another note, 52. It doesn't matter what node I play, it doesn't matter what velocity it's at, every note event will have its own ID. And this is good in case you want to manipulate volume on an individual level or something. So the reason we want to ignore the event first is so that Kontakt doesn't automatically play back samples from every group that exists, because we want to trigger the groups individually. So, again, this is going to be common to a lot of different scripts. Your next step is usually going to be disallow group and all groups. Now, disallow group does exactly what it says it does. It disallows a group so that it won't play back. If we disallow group 1 and comment this out for a second using, I've forgotten what they're called, wavy brackets. Wow, I feel dumb. Anyway, let's compile that and paste it into the script editor and have a look at what's going on inside the group editor. Now, the first time we played, both of these groups triggered, but now only this group is triggering. Now you might wonder, hold on, we said disallow group 1. Shouldn't this be group 1? Well, no, because nearly everything inside of Kontakt is 0 indexed. So this group is actually group 0. This group is group 1, which is a little confusing because up here it says group 2 out of 2. But you just have to remember that everything, including arrays, parameters, nearly everything is 0 indexed. So the lowest value of everything will always be 0. So instead of disallowing just group 1, let's disallow group all groups. Now this is another one of those specific variables. In this case, it literally just means all groups. So this will disallow all groups. And our next step is going to be to set up a round robin variable that toggles back and forth and allow a group based on that variable. So in order to do that, we're going to need to declare ourselves a variable up here. So let's declare round robin. Now we need to set up a little script so that round robin becomes 0 when we hit a key. When we hit another key, it becomes 1. When we hit another key, it becomes 0 again. So it needs to swap back and forth. There's a really easy way to build these kind of toggling things. All you need to do is say round robin is equal to the absolute value of round robin minus 1. Let's just have a think through that in pseudocode. If round robin is 0, this is 0, we're going to subtract 1 from it, we get -1, and we're going to take the absolute value of that, which is 1. Round robin is now equal to 1. Next time we hit a key, round robin is 1, minus 1, you get 0, take the absolute value of that, it's still 0. So every time we hit a note, round robin will toggle back and forth. And in order to demonstrate that, let's use the message function again, and this time we're just going to message round robin. Compile that, paste it into the script editor. Now every time we play a note, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1. Perfect. Now all we need to do is enable a group based on this variable. So we've disallowed all of our groups. Now all we need to do is say allow group round robin. So when we hit a key, first it'll allow group 0. When we hit another key, it'll allow group 1. So now that we've allowed this group, there's one more thing we need to do. Because we ignored the event at first, Kontakt is not actually going to play back any samples until we tell it to. So the last step in this is going to be the play note function. And this is where having a script editor like Sublime Text or Nil's KScript editor is really useful. I can type the name of a function, which also auto-completes, which is nice, so I can, if I've forgotten a function name, it's easier to remember. And if I hit tab, it'll tell me what parameters I need to pass for that function in order for it to work. So we're telling Kontakt to play a note, and it's asking what note number do we want to play. This is just the MIDI note number of whatever note we want to play back. In this case, we actually want to use the note number that we played at first. So if I play a C on the keyboard, I want it to play a C. If I play a D, I want it to play a D. For this, we can use another one of those Kontakt variables. This time it's going to be event note. This variable is not at all the same as event ID. Event ID, as you remember earlier, is just basically a random number that's associated with an event. The event note is the note number of whatever key you use to trigger that event. For velocity, well, it doesn't really matter because our samples are mapped across the entire velocity range, but we can use another one of these variables if we want event velocity. Similarly to event note, event velocity will just take whatever velocity was played to trigger the event. Sample offset, we'll talk about that later, but for now let's just set that to 0. And duration, let's just set that to -1. Now if we hit F5 and compile this and paste it into the script editor, we should finally have a mostly working instrument. So if we play a note, we get RR is equal to 1, which means it's activating this group here, as we saw. If we play another note, it's now triggering the first group. And every time we play a note, it'll alternate between those two groups. So there's a super basic round-robin script for you. As a last step, let's do an on-UI control callback. And instead of using this button, let's go ahead and use a slider. And let's call it slider. And to declare a slider, you need to include in parentheses the minimum value and the maximum value of the slider. In general, it's good practice to keep all sliders in your UI as 0 to 127. That way, if you attach a MIDI controller to that knob, it'll map 1 to 1 and you won't run into any weird scaling issues. So we have our slider. Let's make our callback. So on UI control and slider. So every time we touch slider, this code is going to run. Now let's say we just want this slider to control dynamics, just group volume. Well, for this we're going to use one more very important function inside of Kontakt, which is set engine par. And as the name implies, this allows you to set all kinds of engine parameters. So this is group volume, bus volume, tuning. It allows you to, if you insert some effects, you will use set engine par to modify the effects, the EQ, all sorts of things. So anytime you're modifying some kind of parameter of this sort inside of Kontakt, you're going to be using set engine par. So again, if we hit tab, it'll give us the parentheses with all of the parameters that we need to pass to this function in order to make it work. Now, this is where having the scripting manual handy will be very useful, because a lot of these functions are a little bit hard to remember exactly what you need to pass to them. So let's do a quick search for set engine par and have a look at what the syntax for that looks like. So here we have, something similar to what we have in the editor. The first parameter is called parameter. Now, this is the name of the parameter that you want to modify. So if you're modifying cutoff, you'd use engine par cutoff. And there's a list of every engine par available inside the scripting manual. Value is literally just the value that you want to set that parameter to. And these parameters, group, slot, and generic, will change depending on what you want to do. And you can read the full description for all of these in the manual, because there's a lot of things this function can do. Now, what I want to do for this instrument is modify the group volume so that we get, sort of a rudimentary dynamic control over the instrument. So first we need to select what group we want. Slot, we don't really care about slot since we're not using an effect. And if you read the descriptions through here, you'll see that none of these apply to our current situation. And it says for all other situations, set this parameter to -1. So that's what we'll do. And again, for the generic, there's a lot of cases in which we'll use the generic for something, but again, we don't need to, so we're just going to set that to -1. So let's come back to our script. The parameter we want to modify is engine par volume. And since I'm trying to keep all of this native KSP again, so you can just copy paste this right into Kontakt without compiling it, I'm going to include the $sign. When you're working inside the editor, what's really nice is you actually don't need any of these $signs. If you're declaring an array, you use a % symbol. So let's say we wanted to declare an array. We would do %array and then however many elements we wanted in that array. But because the compiler is awesome, we don't actually need to include that, and it'll recognize, oh, this has brackets after it, that means it wants to declare an array. So one additional benefit of using an editor over using Notepad or something. So again, setting up our volume modulation. Well, there's one problem. The value that we want to set this to is not just the value of slider. Now, I'm going to do a demonstration first and show you why that is. So let's just say we want to modify the volume of group 0. Slot and generic we said needed to be -1. And we're going to be updating that. We're going to be updating the volume of group 0 with the value of slider. So let's hit F5 and paste that into Kontakt. See, we now have a slider. And if we have a look down here at our group volume, we can close the mapping editor, and we can close the script editor. If we have a look at the group volume for group 0, and as we move this slider, it's going to jump. Boom, it jumped. And it's staying at negative infinity. Well, the problem is that most of these parameters use a value from 0 to 1 million. So, 0 dB does not correspond to a value of 0 for that knob. It's some weird fraction in between. And 12 dB is actually a value of 1 million. There's a couple different ways we can get around this. One of the easier ways is just to set yourself up with some scaling. So let's declare a quick variable called temp. I know, it's sloppy coding. And that's actually all I need to do to declare a variable, because remember, we don't really need the $sign, so I'm just going to leave it like that. So let's set temp equal to the value of slider times some value, which we're about to figure out. So in order to do this, we're just going to divide 1 million by 127. And that gives us 7,874. So if you think about this, when slider is 0, temp is going to be 0. When slider is 127, it's going to be 127 times 7,874. It's really close to a million. It's not perfect, but it's close enough for this example. Now, instead of setting the group volume based on the value of slider, we'll just set it based on temp. If we hit F5 and compile this, paste it into the script editor, and wiggle our slider. Now, if you watch the group volume, you can see that that actually scales very nicely from 0 to 12 dB, or negative infinity to 12 dB. Now, as a last step, I'm going to go ahead and, right now we're only modifying the group volume for group 0. If we come to group 2, if we come to group 1, nothing happens because we haven't told Kontakt to modify this volume yet. So let's go ahead and just copy and paste this, and instead of modifying group 0, we'll modify group 1 as well, and hit F5. Paste it in. Now if we move our slider, we're updating both the value of the volume for group 0 and for group 1. So now we have super rudimentary dynamic control. So I'm going to go ahead and enable keyboard. Yeah, there we go. So now if I... Excellent. So I think I'm going to leave it at that for now. There's a lot I haven't covered yet, but that gives you a super basic overview of the general structure that an instrument will have and some of the main functions that you'll need to use. As a quick recap, I'm just going to talk about this section again, the on note section, because this is probably the most important of what I've covered so far. I'm going to slim it down to just the absolute basics. So I'm going to delete this. Your first step is going to be to ignore all events that come into Kontakt. We don't want Kontakt playing any notes unless we specifically tell it to using a play note command. We want to disallow all groups. Most of the time, if you have more than one group, you'll probably want to disallow at least one of them. And then we're going to allow the groups based on a certain condition. So, if we had different articulations, we might say, if our articulation switcher is 1, allow this group. If our articulation switcher is 2, allow this group. And after allowing your groups, you're going to end with a play note command, which will play whatever note you tell Kontakt to. In this case, we're playing the same note that was used to trigger this callback with the same velocity that was used to trigger the callback. You can get a little bit more advanced with release samples, but again, I think I'm just going to leave it at that for now. If the video was helpful, please let me know what you'd like to see in the future. If there's anything I haven't covered that you'd like to see. I know not many people watch these tutorials, but I hope if I keep putting them out there, maybe it'll help a couple people create some really excellent Kontakt instruments. Again, I hope this was helpful, and thanks very much for watching. Bye-bye.